the prophecy of Isaiah. We've now reached presentation 24, which I've entitled The Problem of Fear. Let's look back for a moment. The people of God, the people of Judah, had brought disasters upon themselves by their persistent rebellion against God. They lost their way in life. In practice, God had been marginalized, privatized, ritualized. And as a result, the ethical moral fibre of the nation had become too weak, and it couldn't withstand the onslaught from empires round about. And it was threatened and attacked and eventually overrun. But the message that Isaiah was bringing to his people was, despite all that, God was still there. God was still going to rescue his people, rescue them from the dreadful inevitable consequences of the rebellion, which ended up in exile in Babylon. But there was a condition. He looked for some kind of response. He would rescue, but if the people wanted to move into their destiny, they had to be willing to be rescued. Isaiah establishes some great principles that still apply today. God still wants to rescue his people, the people of Judah, at that time the people of God today in the West, so that we can share the good news of the rescue with others. And Isaiah starts and focuses on an understanding of God. God was not just a tribal deity, a figment of the imagination. Isaiah grasped the absolute superiority of God, the God who made the universe, the God who created everything but stood outside his creation and yet at the same time wanted to be intimately involved with humanity. And the idea of creating some sort of representation of God, in his day it was an idol. Today it's all sorts of abstractions like materialism. But any kind of representation of God, simply a nonsense. We can't fabricate God from his own creation, and that includes fabricating God from our minds, creating the God in our minds that suits ourselves. And there's plenty of that in the religions throughout the world today. Isaiah grasped the absolute majesty and the grandeur of God. Perhaps his experience in the temple all these years before had laid the foundation. He saw that God was sovereign over all his creation, but he was also sovereign over all events and history. God had a plan that was being worked out through. Human responsibility was to become part of that or to try and stand in the way of that. God's not part of his creation, and the creation is not part of God. He stands separate from it. And he's not some detached force that just set the universe in motion, but he's intimately involved in the lives of humanity. Now that means you and me. And Isaiah grasped and expressed his understanding of God. There is no one and nothing like God. In a kind of a strange way, the word that the Hebrews used for God, Yahweh, captures all of that, because that word means the self-existent one, but also means the God of relationship. God the creator beyond the creation, but God the one who involves in relationship with human beings. And Isaiah went back and captured something of the meaning of that for his people. The situation they were in, that characterized the nation of Judah. The leadership were in it for what they could make for themselves, in general, although there were some exceptions. And they just wouldn't listen to what the great prophetic figures were saying to them. But the people weren't much better. They'd privatized God, put God and set him up in the rituals of the temple and left him there. Relationship had vanished. They were rebelling against the ways of God. And the whole political, religious and ethical fabric of society, it was just falling apart and crumbling. And many of the great prophets picture the disasters that were happening in the nation. It usually ends up with the rich becoming richer and the poor losing out. And that was what was happening. Threats from the empire of Assyria. But Isaiah grasped that the growing threats from Babylonia would be much more serious, and that Babylon would overrun the nation, sack Jerusalem, and take the people into exile. And it all happened. But the problem goes back to the people of God. They had chosen to push God to the sidelines of their society. And as a result, their whole political, ethical, moral, spiritual basis of the whole society was so weakened that they couldn't stand against the threats coming from round about. So you have to deal with the internal problem if you're going to get to an answer. And Isaiah saw that exile in Babylon, it was inevitable. They just wouldn't be able to withstand it. Then he asks the question, is there any future? Any future for God's people if they're just wiped out, the land wiped out, the temple flattened, Jerusalem burnt to the ground, and the people taken into exile? Yes, their rebellion. Did that mean that God was ultimately going to reject them? Has God really written off his people? These are the great questions that Isaiah was addressing, and there's a lot of relevance for us today. We've privatized God. We've locked God up in our religious systems and the rituals of our church activities. Our numbers are declining. Our influence in society, almost zero. We're being marginalized, put down, and even at times persecuted. We've gone into exile, or we're going into our exile. Has God written us off? We deserve it because of what we've done. But is there any future for God's people today? He saw the sacking of the land of Judah. He saw the total destruction of Jerusalem. He saw the people going into exile in Babylon. Isaiah grasped the inevitability, the inevitable consequences of the behavior of the nation and its leadership. It would follow as night, and it was a dark night, would follow day. Rebellion and failure. It meant they lost their land. They lost their king. They lost their temple. The land, the means of survival. The king that represented the nation. The temple that was religious center of life. All gone. And they were faced with despair. And that's the question that Isaiah is addressing in these chapters. Is there any future for the people of God? Is there any light shafting into the darkness of the cavern into which they've consigned themselves? Now, over these chapters, Isaiah reveals new insights into what God is doing and will do. And it's all based on the nature of who God is and his long-term agenda and purposes. And themes are woven together, and ideas develop and deepen difficult to extract and follow the sequence, because Isaiah was getting deeper and deeper insights into what God was doing. And the next few presentations are going to try and track through the insights that Isaiah brings to us, because they were ever deepening. He was moving out as God showed him more, as he grasped more, as he could understand more. And he brings these to us, ever deepening insights into what God was doing. And that led to new understandings about God himself and his purposes for humanity. It led to new understandings about how God would take these purposes forward. God has got an agenda for humanity, an agenda for the world. We are totally free to identify and opt into it, or to reject and fight against it, but it still happens. And from that, Isaiah grasped the future role of the people of God. That there was a future, that there was hope, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. Utter failure. Isaiah saw that the nation, the people of God, they had failed. God had rescued them from slavery in Egypt, given them a land to survive on, and given them so much, but the people had turned away, and they'd pushed God to the margins of public life and personal life. They'd ritualized God into the temple. They'd privatized God out of the events of life. They had failed, and their leadership was self-serving. There were some good kings. They tried their best to bring the nation back. Some of them made some progress, but usually it just got pushed back again with a successor king. Exile was inevitable. The whole social fabric was crumbling. The basis of law, the basis of equity, the basis of justice, they'd gone. And the poor people were suffering. And when they ended up in exile, there they were sitting in Babylon. What's this all about? Yes, we deserve it. We brought it on ourselves, but is there any answer? Is there any hope? What's the point? And Isaiah stresses that self-effort was doomed to more failure. Fundamental principle. We've got to be willing, and when we're willing, God steps in to make it possible. Collaboration and cooperation. But try to do it on our own, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, doesn't work. Never has, never will. And that's where so many political systems have fallen apart. We've got to be willing. That's a decision. And then God steps in and does it. And Isaiah saw, it's painted vividly in these chapters, hope for the future. God hadn't left his people. They had left him, pushed him to the edge of life, but he hadn't left them. And his purposes were going on. There are long-term purposes. And Isaiah saw that God, the Yahweh of Judah, he wasn't just another tribal god. Every tribe and empire had its god. But largely these gods were of human creation, made out of our minds, in some cases made out of physical objects. No, God was separate from his creation. He couldn't be fabricated. He was the Lord of glory. And there was a purpose and history, and the whole events of the time were moving towards that. God's purpose would be fulfilled. But woven into this, Isaiah was grasping that where the kingly line had failed and was going to be wiped out, a new king was coming. A king described as a servant king. And this new king would succeed where the previous kingly line had failed and where the nation had failed. He would identify with the royal line, but he would also identify with the entire nation. And he would succeed in carrying forward God's purposes where the people of Judah had failed. And as a result of this, the nations of the world would be blessed. Now with hindsight we can see all of that being fulfilled in the life of Jesus, the great servant king, and the impact of Jesus on the world, throughout the world, then and today. It simply goes on as God's purposes move on. There is hope for the future. Very important principle. It's worth pondering. When we grasp, as Isaiah did, just what God is doing and who He's like, then it starts to put everything in life into a new perspective. It gives us meaning, makes sense of a lot of things. But our puny minds have difficulty in grasping that. Now, with that background, let's look at some of the details. Where Isaiah draws and he's weaving a story. He's developing themes and ideas throughout these several chapters, as ever deepening insights are being brought to him. Be silent before me, you islands. Let the nations renew their strength. Let them come forward and speak. Let us meet together at the place of judgment. Who has stirred up one from the east, calling him in righteousness to his service? He hands nations over to him and subdues kings before him. He turns them to dust with his sword, to wind-blown chaff with his bow. He pursues them and moves on unscathed by a path his feet have not travelled before. Who has done this and carried it through, calling forth the generations from the beginning? Isaiah saw something of what was going to happen. Assyria would be toppled by Babylon. But Babylon, who would take them into exile and destroy their land, Babylon would be toppled by a king from the east. God had his plan and purpose in all of this. And it goes on, I, the Lord, with the first of them and with the last, I am He. I've carried this all through. The islands have seen it and fear. The ends of the earth tremble. They approach and come forward. They help each other. They say to their companions, be strong. The metalwork encourages the goldsmith. The one who smooths with the hammer spurs on the one who strikes the anvil. One says of the welding, it is good. The other nails down the idol so that it will not topple. Isaiah imagines a challenge by God to all the people groups of the world. Islands speaks of the nations at the very edge of the known earth. Nations speaks of the nations that are round about the land of Judah. A challenge to all the nations, the ones that were nearby, the ones that were far distant. A challenge coming from God Himself. Isaiah was grasping something deeper of God. Isaiah grasped that God was the Lord of creation. He wasn't a tribal god represented by some idol or artifact or philosophy, which is the way of religion today. God was the Lord of creation who made everything. And He controlled the destiny of history according to His purposes. We could opt in or opt out. But He also saw that God was separate from His creation. And then on top of that, he grasped that God was relating Himself to humanity. God was interested in human beings, in our welfare, that we might identify with His purposes and get fulfillment in this. And He's calling the nations to judgment, to look at this, to explore this and examine this. God who was in control. Some religions have God as distant as the Lord of creation. Some religions have failed to separate God from His creation, particularly Eastern religions. But the way of the Bible pictures God in a relationship to individuals and to the destiny of humanity in a positive sense. That is unique to the biblical record. It's been lost in Islam, where God has been left distant to a very large extent. Isaiah was grasping something of the nature of God, and it's worth sitting down and pondering and working this through and studying the biblical record. How do the biblical authors understand God? Because that puts everything else into perspective. And what God does is in line with his overall purposes. And God's purposes were to reach out to humanity and through his people to reach other nations and people groups. And bringing another empire up to bring Babylon down was part of that long-term goal. That's his ultimate goal. He wants to make us more like Jesus. His purpose is to reproduce within you and me and all humanity something of his nature and character. And we see that completely in Jesus. And the simple way to grasp this is he wants to make us steadily more like Jesus. And if humanity moved that way, the problems that humanity faces today would start to dissipate and evaporate. Because the agenda of Jesus and the nature of Jesus was always the best for the other person. And if we all lived that way, what a wonderful community, society, nations, and international relationships. What a wonderful production that would be. And Isaiah saw, and this is difficult for us to grasp, that all the great power blocks of the world, all these much vaunted leaders that seem to be of enormous power, you can't touch them. In God's eyes, they're but a flicker of an eyelid. They're nothing. They come and they go. Now we can look back in history and see this. The great empires and the great people have given themselves enormous power. In the end of the day, they come and they go. And life moves on. They have no long-term significance. And that for the people of Judah, the attacks of Assyria, the threat of Babylon, exile facing them. These things are passing, brought upon them by their own rebellion, yes. But these people who had given themselves power and authority and great armies, and who were brutal in what they did, in the long run in God's plans, they have no long-term significance. They come and they go. And indeed there are many leaders in some of the nations of the world today. It'd be worthwhile them pondering that lesson. The God of the Bible and the God that's in the book of Isaiah, God reveals himself in the context of human historical experience. He relates to you and me, and he's seen and understood in terms of that relationship and the events of history. Too often God has become a philosophical abstraction invented by clever human minds. Too often God has been reduced to what we can understand. There are elements of that in many religions. God's bigger than all of that. And he makes himself known in the events of life as he relates to you and me. We looked at Isaiah's developing understanding of God. Now the second part, his understanding of humans. He recognized that Babylon itself would fall to an empire from the east. It did. But amidst all these cataclysmic and enormous events that took place over these centuries. The amazing thing is that the nations preferred to develop their own gods. Gods that have been shown again and again, the little tribal gods that are made out of their human minds, that did nothing for them, could not control history, could not rescue them or save them. The gods of Assyria couldn't save Assyria. The gods of Babylon couldn't save Babylon. And indeed the gods of the empires that followed couldn't save these empires. Each came, each went. But the people of God went on, because their God Yahweh was not a tribal god, an invention of the mind, but was the Lord of glory. And you've got exactly the same today. Power blocks come, power blocks go. Great leaders with great power come and they go. But the people of God, the followers of Jesus, go on, develop, and indeed grow in numbers throughout the world, and are still growing in numbers despite what our media would pretend to suggest. Isaiah is amazed. People just want to invent their own gods. And it's an amazing comment. I have been staggered in discussion with so many people. Trained as a scientist, my arguments have to be based on evidence. Otherwise the argument has no substance. And yet people will argue black is white and ignore the evidence, explain it away, sideline it. They'll do anything they can but face the evidence. And this is true today, but it was true in the days of Isaiah. We in the West are doing this. Our political leaders, some of whom are good and some are not so good. Some start with great aspirations and good intentions, and it doesn't always last. But we don't have the answers. Our political systems don't have the answers. Why won't we look at the evidence? If God is the God who made the universe, and underneath it in the West most people have a vague belief in that, surely God knows the best way to run our life and societies. Surely He has a purpose for making humanity. Why don't we seek it out? But our leadership today and our societies today in the West will do anything but face that evidence. And Islam is not much better. Again and again in my discussion with Muslims, they won't face the evidence. When Islam, as a religious system and a political system in the Middle East, was shown not to have produced the goods, and that compared to the West they were falling steadily behind, and the evidence for that is overwhelming. They didn't look at themselves and say, have we got this wrong? No, they decided to go back to 7th century Islam and impose a medieval system which has come out now in the atrocities into the West and throughout the Islamic world. Why won't we face the evidence? Isaiah pictures that. He pictures people saying, making metal workers, smoothing with a hammer, hard work, saying it is good. And then the almost sarcastic, the other nails down the idol so it will not topple. The idols of the West and Islam will topple, and they spend all their time trying to nail them down and pretend they're worth something. Oh, what deep thoughts for us today. And then Isaiah focuses on the people of God. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, you descendants of Abraham, my friend, I took you from the ends of the earth, from the farthest corners I called you. I said, you are my servant, I have chosen you, and I have not rejected you. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. God had rescued the people from slavery in Egypt. He had given them a land. And He was going to bring them out of exile to form the nation again. And though that nation failed and was never fully free, out of that nation came the Lord Jesus Christ, who transformed the world. God had done that. God would continue to rescue His people. He still had a purpose for his people. Isaiah grasped that, and it's a message of encouragement to his people who were in a complete mess because of their rebellion. So he's saying, reject fear, reject doubt, don't be dismayed, do not fear. Whatever mess you've landed yourself in, come back to God. He's prepared and ready and willing to bring you through. He still has a purpose in this. Now in this we've got to distinguish between the nation state, in this case the nation state of Judah, and individual responsibility. The nation of Israel, using its wider term, the people of God, the people who had been descended from those who had been rescued from Egypt, who were descended going back to Abraham himself. But then there's the citizens of the nation without individual responsibilities. Now the people of God, through whom God's purposes will be fulfilled, they had failed, but God's purposes hadn't altered. And God would rescue them, and if they were willing as individuals, they would enter into their destiny. But we have free choice as individuals to identify with God's purpose or not. You can see this vividly in the life of Jesus and in his teaching. He came to his people. He was sent to rescue his people. The word that's used is save, but it's better translated as rescue. To rescue them from their rebellion so that they could fulfill their destiny. But the individual people, the people of the land of Israel in the days of Jesus, had free choice. Many chose to listen to him and follow him, to identify with God's purposes in Jesus. But large numbers chose not to. And the religious leadership chose not to. And in the process, they signed their destiny. They wrote themselves out of God's plan, and they wrote the nation out of God's plan. But individuals went on. The people of God went on. There's a distinction we have to make. Isaiah's pictured something very deep. Don't fear, you've got complete security in me. Get me back to the center of your life as individuals and as a nation. I'll see you through, whatever comes. Because I am the self-existent one. I am the Creator, the Lord of glory. I'm not some tribal god that can be pushed around by other tribal gods. They have no meaning. I am the one who made everything. And he's described as I am when he revealed himself to Moses. But God is also the God of relationship. The people were given this name Yahweh. And Yahweh captures that not only God is the self-existent one, the Lord of glory, but he's the God of relationship within himself and towards humanity. And Isaiah describes that as your God. He's personal. You can know him. You can relate to him. You can hear him. You can trust him. He's on your side. He's with you in it, whatever comes. And he will provide answers. You don't have the answers. You're not strong enough. But if you're willing to take them, they're there. So Isaiah says, strengthened. He will strengthen us, help us, and uphold us. That's the God of provision. And it's all based on what Isaiah calls righteous action. His righteous right hand. God knows what he's doing. It's right, it's moral, it's ethical. It's got a purpose, it's got a direction. It's right. God is totally consistent in his actions with his long-term purpose and the way he relates to us. What a magnificent picture. But Isaiah goes on. All who rage against you will surely be ashamed and disgraced. Those who wage war against you will be as nothing at all. For I am the Lord your God who takes hold of your right hand and says to you, do not fear, I will help you. Do not be afraid, you worm Jacob. That just means you're of insignificance in your own eyes. Little Israel, do not fear. For I myself will help you, declares the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. See, I will make you into a threshing sledge, new and sharp with many teeth. And you will rejoice in the Lord and glory in the Holy One of Israel. The poor and needy search for water, but there's none. Their tongues are parched with thirst, but I, the Lord, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will make rivers flow in barren heights and springs within the valleys, so that people may see and know, may consider and understand that the hand of the Lord has done this, that the Holy One of Israel has created it. You get the impression very strongly from this. Nothing can stand in God's way for his long-term plans. Yes, we can resist and we can rebel. We opt out of his plans. But the plans go on. God is in the business of reaching out and calling a people to himself. He called the people, the descendants of Abram, to himself and did so much for that people. But he did it so that they would reach out to other people groups. They would make known the God who had rescued them. And God does exactly the same today within the people of God, the followers of Jesus. He calls people to himself. We come to Jesus. We let him be king. We enter the kingdom of God. But God's goal is that we reach out by our lives, by the way we live, by what we do, what we say, to reach out and share the nature of that God, make Jesus known to those around us. But we've all got the freedom to opt into God's plans or not. God doesn't trample through us. God's sovereignty does not contradict the way he's made humanity. And humanity was made with freedom of choice, which is an inevitable consequence of being a spiritual being. But the overall drive, God is seeking to draw people to himself, transform lives and make us more like Jesus. That is going on and will go on, is going on in the world today. It's going on magnificently in parts of the world today, where large numbers are coming to Jesus, for example in China, for example in one or two Middle Eastern countries, but it's under the radar because of threats of death. It's happened in sub-Saharan Africa. It's happened intermittently in parts of South America. We in the West have lost it for the moment, but it could happen again. When we go God's way, God's with us. Nothing can stand in our way. We become like a threshing machine that just thrashes up the corn and produces the good seed to feed the population. God will provide and protect. These are messages the people of Judah needed to hear. And probably as they looked at this in the days of exile, it gave them an encouragement to keep going. And God will meet every spiritual hunger and thirst that we have. God's long-term plans go on, but we have the freedom and the choice to opt in. We've got to ponder this. And indeed it's a message to the people of God and our religious systems in the West. We've got to put our religious systems in order. We've privatized God, we've ritualized God, we've cut him off from the public arena. Let's release Jesus in our lives. Let our communities be transformed. We can't do it, but we've got to be willing to do it. We've got to opt into God's plans. He will provide. He will protect. There will be the meeting of spiritual hunger and thirst. We do not need to live in fear of annihilation and obliteration with the forces that are attacking the churches in the West. Isaiah uses the phrase, your Redeemer, on numerous occasions in these sections of his prophecy. And he's speaking of a God who rescues his people. What a wonderful hope. And he says to them, let people look at this, let them see, let them know, let them consider, let them understand. The hand of the Lord has done this. We can't improve ourselves. Self-effort doesn't work. But we've got to opt into God's plans. We've got to be willing for his way. And then he does it. And others, if they truly look at it, will see the hand of the Lord has done this. It's been my privilege to see lives utterly messed up being transformed, renewed in ways that blow our mind. Certainly has blown my mind. God can do it with individual lives. He can do it with our community life. He can do it within our church groups. There's a great message of hope here. We need not live in fear. We're facing real obstacles today in the West, and they're getting greater. Let's go the way of Isaiah and get back to a better understanding of who God is, how He works, and what His agenda is. That's what the people of Judah needed. That's what we need. That will drive out our fears and give us a confidence to move forward, not in our strength, but in Him, who is our Redeemer, the Lord of glory. That's the message of the prophecy of Isaiah. In the next presentation we shall look at God's future plans.